The Break by Katherena Vermette. When Stella, a young Métis mother, looks out her window one evening and spots someone in trouble on the break, a barren field on an isolated strip of land outside her house, she calls the police to alert them to a possible crime. In a series of shifting narratives, people who are connected with the victim, police, family, and friends, tell their personal stories leading up to that fateful night. Son of a Trickster by Eden Robinson. Meet Jared Martin, 16-year-old pot cookie dealer, smoker, drinker, and son with the scariest mom ever. But Jared's the pot dealer with a heart of gold, really. Compassionate, caring, and nurturing by nature, Jared's determined to help hold his family together. But when it comes to being cared and loved, Jared knows he can't rely on his family. And then there's the talking ravens and the blackouts and his grandmother's perpetual suspicion that he is not human, but the son of a trickster. The Marrow of Thieves by Cherie Dimaline. Humanity has nearly destroyed its world through global warming, but now an even greater evil lurks. The indigenous people of North America are being hunted and harvested for their bone marrow, which carries the key to recovering something the rest of the population has lost: the ability to dream. In this dark world, Frenchie and his companions struggle to survive as they make their way up north to the old lands. For now, survival means staying hidden, but what they don't know is that one of them holds the secret to defeating the Marrow Thieves. Empire of Wild by Cherie Dimaline. Broken-hearted Joan has been searching for her husband, Victor, for almost a year, ever since he went missing on the night they had their first serious argument. One hungover morning in a Walmart parking lot in a little town near Georgian Bay, she is drawn to a revival tent where the local Métis have been flocking to hear a charismatic preacher. By the time she staggers into the tent, the service is over, but as she is about to leave, she hears an unmistakable voice. She turns, and there is Victor. Only he insists he is not Victor, but the Reverend Eugene Wolfe, on a mission to bring his people to Jesus. And he doesn't seem to be faking. There isn't even a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Birdie by Tracey Lindberg. Bernice Mitus, a Cree woman, leaves her home in northern Alberta following tragedy and travels to Gibsons, BC. She is on something of a vision quest, seeking to understand the messages from The Frugal Gourmet, one of the only television shows available on CBC North, that come to her in her dreams. She is also driven by the leftover teenage desire to meet Pat Johns, who played Jesse on The Beachcombers, because he is, as she says, a working, healthy Indian man. Bernice heads for Molly's Reach to find answers, but they are not the ones she expected. Indian Horse by Richard Wagamese. Saul Indian Horse has hit bottom. His last binge almost killed him, and now he's a reluctant resident in a treatment center for alcoholics, surrounded by people he's sure will never understand him. But Saul wants peace, and he grudgingly comes to see that he'll find it only through telling his story. With him, readers embark on a journey back through the life he's led as a northern Ojibwe, with all its joys and sorrows. Split Tooth by Tanya Tagaq. Veering back and forth between the grittiest features of a small Arctic town, the electrifying proximity of World of Animals, and ravishing world of myth, Tanya Tagaq explores a world where the distinctions between good and evil, animal and human, victim and transgressor, real and imagined, lose their meaning, but the guiding power of love remains. Haunting, brooding, exhilarating, and tender all at once, Tagaq moves effortlessly between fiction and memoir, myth and reality, poetry and prose, and conjures a world and a heroine readers will never forget. Jonny Appleseed by Joshua Whitehead. Off the reserve and trying to find ways to live and love in the big city, Jonny, a young two-spirit indigiqueer, becomes a cybersex worker who fetishizes himself in order to make a living. Self-ordained as an Indian glitter princess, Jonny has 1 week before he must return to the res and his former life to attend the funeral of his stepfather. The 7 days that follow are like a fevered dream. Stories of love, trauma, sex, kinship, ambition, and the heartbreaking recollection of his beloved Kukum, grandmother. Jonny's life is a series of breakages, appendages, and linkages, and as he goes through the motions of preparing to return home, he learns how to put together the pieces of his life. This Wound is a World by Billy Ray Belcourt. Part manifesto, part memoir, This Wound is a World issues a call to turn to love and sex to understand how Indigenous peoples shoulder sadness and pain like theirs without giving up on the future. His poems upset genre and play with form, scavenging for a decolonial kind of heaven where everyone is at least a little gay. From the Ashes by Jessie Thistle. In this extraordinary and inspiring debut memoir, Jessie Thistle, once a high school dropout and now a rising Indigenous scholar, chronicles his life on the streets and how he overcame trauma and addiction to discover the truth about who he is. 7 Fallen Feathers: Racism, Death, and Hard Truths in a Northern City by Tanya Talaga. From 2000 to 2011, 7 Indigenous high school students died in Thunder Bay, Ontario. The 7 were hundreds of miles away from their families, forced to leave home and live in a foreign and unwelcoming city. Using a sweeping narrative focusing on the lives of the students, award-winning investigative journalist Tanya Talaga delves into the history of this small northern city that has come to manifest Canada's long struggle with human rights violations against Indigenous communities. All Our Relations: Finding the Path Forward, CBC Massey Lectures by Tanya Talaga. In this vital and incisive work, Tanya Talaga explores the alarming rise of youth suicide in Indigenous communities in Canada and beyond. From Northern Ontario to Nunavut, Norway, Brazil, Australia, and the United States, the Indigenous experience in colonized nations is startlingly similar and deeply disturbing. It is an experience marked by the violent separation of peoples from the land, the separation of families, and the separation of individuals from traditional ways of life, all of which has culminated in a spiritual separation that has had an enduring impact on generations of Indigenous children. As a result of this colonial legacy, too many communities today lack access to the basic determinants of health: income, employment, education, a safe environment, health services, leading to a mental health and youth suicide crisis on a global scale. But, Talaga reminds us, First Peoples also share a history of resistance, resilience, and civil rights activism. Hart Berries by Terese Marie Mailhot. Hart Berries is a powerful, poetic memoir of a woman's coming of age on the Seabird Island Indian Reservation in the Pacific Northwest. Having survived a profoundly dysfunctional upbringing, only to find herself hospitalized and facing a dual diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder and bipolar II disorder, Terese Marie Mailhot is given a notebook and begins to write her way out of trauma. The triumphant result is Hart Berries, a memorial for Mailhot's mother, a social worker and activist who had a thing for prisoners, a story of reconciliation with her father, an abusive drunk and a brilliant artist, who was murdered under mysterious circumstances, and an elegy on how difficult it is to love someone while dragging the long shadows of shame. The Right to be Cold: One Woman's Story of Protecting Her Culture, the Arctic, and the Whole Planet by Sheila Watt-Cloutier. The Arctic ice is receding each year, but just as irreplaceable is the culture, the wisdom that has allowed the Inuit to thrive in the far north for so long. And it's not just the Arctic. The whole world is changing in dangerous, unpredictable ways. Sheila Watt-Cloutier has devoted her life to protecting what is threatened and nurturing what has been wounded. In this culmination of Watt-Cloutier's regional, national, and international work over the last 25 years, The Right to Be Cold explores the parallels between safeguarding the Arctic and the survival of Inuit culture. A Mind Spread Out on the Ground by Alicia Elliott. In an urgent and visceral work that asks essential questions about the treatment of Native people in North America, while drawing on intimate details of her own life and experience with intergenerational trauma, Alicia Elliott offers indispensable insight into the ongoing legacy of colonialism. She engages with such wide-ranging topics as race, parenthood, love, mental illness, poverty, sexual assault, gentrification, writing, and representation, and in the process makes connections, both large and small, between the past and present, the personal and political. Highway of Tears, a true story of racism, indifference, and the pursuit of justice for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, by Jessica McDermott. For decades, Indigenous women and girls have gone missing or been found murdered along an isolated stretch of highway in northwestern British Columbia. The highway is known as the Highway of Tears, and it has come to symbolize a national crisis. Journalist Jessica McDermott investigates the devastating effect these tragedies have had on the families of the victims and their communities, and how systemic racism and indifference have created a climate where Indigenous women and girls are over-policed yet under-protected. Through interviews with those closest to the victims, McDermott offers an intimate, first-hand account of their loss and relentless fight for justice. Picking Up the Pieces, Residential School Memories, and the Making of the Witness Blanket. Picking Up the Pieces tells the story of the making of the Witness Blanket, a living work of art conceived and created by Indigenous artist Carrie Newman. It includes hundreds of items collected from residential schools across Canada, everything from bricks, photos, and letters to hockey skates, dolls, and braids. Every object tells a story. A Knock on the Door, The Essential History of Residential Schools from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, by Phil Fontaine, M.A. Craft, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. Between 2008 and 2015, the TRC provided opportunities for individuals, families, and communities to share their experiences of residential schools and released several reports based on 7,000 survivor statements and 5 million documents from government, churches, and schools, as well as a solid grounding in secondary sources. A Knock on the Door gathers material from the TRC reports to present the essential history and legacy of residential schools and inform the journey to reconciliation that Canadians are now embarked on. In My Own Moccasins, a Memoir of Resilience, by Helen Knott. Helen Knott, a highly accomplished Indigenous woman, seems to have it all, but in her memoir, she offers a different perspective. In My Own Moccasins is an unflinching account of addiction, intergenerational trauma, and the wounds brought on by sexual violence. It is also the story of sisterhood, the power of ceremony, the love of family, and the possibility of redemption. This Place, 150 Years Retold, by many contributors. Explore the last 150 years through the eyes of Indigenous creators in the graphic novel anthology This Place, 150 Years Retold. Beautifully illustrated, these stories are an emotional and enlightening journey through magic realism, serial killings, psychic battles, and time travel. See how Indigenous peoples have survived a post-apocalyptic world since contact. The Inconvenient Indian, a curious account of Native people in North America, by Thomas King. This book is at once a history and a complete subversion of a history. In short, a critical and personal meditation that King has conducted over the past 50 years about what it means to be Indian in North America. Passage by Gwen Benaway. In her second collection of poetry, Gwen Benaway examines what it means to experience violence and speaks to the burden of survival. Traveling to northern Ontario and across the Great Lakes, Passage is a poetic voyage through divorce, family violence, legacy of colonization, and the affirmation of a new sexuality and gender. Previously published as a man, Passage is the poet's first collection written as a trans woman. Striking and raw in sparse lines, the collection showcases a vital, two-spirited identity that transects borders of race, gender, and experience. In Passage, the poet seeks to reconcile herself to the land, the history of her ancestors, and her separation from the partner and family by evoking the beauty and power of her ancestral waterways. Bone Black by Carol Rose Golden Eagle. Wren is devastated when her twin sister, Raven, mysteriously disappears after the two spent an evening visiting a local pub. When Wren files a missing persons report with the local police, she is dismissed and becomes convinced the case will not be properly investigated. As she follows media reports, Wren realizes that the same heartbreak she's feeling is the same for too many families, indeed for whole nations. Something within Wren snaps, and she decides to take justice into her own hands. She soon disappears into a darkness, struggling to come to terms with the type of justice she delivers. Throughout her choices and every step along the way, Wren feels as though she is being guided. But by what? Peace and Good Order: The Case for Indigenous Justice in Canada by Harold R. Johnson. In early 2018, the failures of Canada's justice system were sharply and painfully revealed in the verdicts issued in the deaths of Cote-saint-Luc and Tina Fontaine. The outrage and confusion that followed those verdicts inspired former Crown prosecutor and best-selling author Harold R. Johnson to make the case against Canada for its failure to fulfill its duty under treaty to effectively deliver justice to Indigenous people, worsening the situation and ensuring long-term damage to Indigenous communities. If I Go Missing by Brianna Jonny. Combining graphic fiction and non-fiction, this young adult graphic novel serves as a window into one of the unique dangers of being an Indigenous teen in Canada today. The text of the book is derived from excerpts of a letter written to the Winnipeg Chief of Police by 14-year-old Brianna Jonny, a letter that went viral and was also the basis of a documentary film. In her letter, Jonny calls out the authorities for neglecting to immediately investigate missing Indigenous people and urges them to not treat me as the Indigenous person I am proud to be if she were to be reported missing. Speaking Our Truth: A Journey of Reconciliation by Monique Gray Smith. Canada's relationship with its Indigenous people has suffered as a result of both the residential school system and the lack of understanding of the historical and current impact of those schools. Healing and repairing that relationship requires education, awareness, and increased understanding of the legacy and the impacts still being felt by survivors and their families. Guided by acclaimed Indigenous author Monique Gray Smith, readers will learn about the lives of survivors and listen to allies who are putting the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission into action. Mamaskatch: A Cree Coming of Age by Daryl J. McLeod. Growing up in the tiny village of Smith, Alberta, Daryl J. McLeod was surrounded by his Cree family's history. In shifting and unpredictable stories, his mother, Bertha, shared narratives of their culture, their family, and the cruelty that she and her sisters endured in residential schools. Beautifully written, honest and thought-provoking, Mama's sketch, named for the Cree word used as a response to dreams shared, is ultimately an uplifting account of overcoming personal and societal obstacles. In spite of the traumas of Daryl's childhood, deep and mysterious forces handed down by his mother helped him survive and thrive. Her love and strength stayed with him to build the foundation of what would come to be a very fulfilling and adventurous life. Crow Winter by Karen McBride. Since coming home to Spirit Bear Point First Nation, Hazel Ellis has been dreaming of an old crow. He tells her he's here to help her, save her. From what exactly? Sure, her dad's been dead for almost 2 years, and she hasn't quite reconciled that grief. But is that worth the time of an Algonquin demigod? Soon Hazel learns that there's more at play than just her own sadness and doubt. The quarry that's been lying unsullied for over a century on her father's property is stirring the old magic that crosses the boundaries between this world and the next. With the aid of Nanabush, an ancient troublemaker, Hazel must unravel a web of deceit that, if left untouched, could destroy her family and her home on both sides of the medicine wheel. Moon of the Crested Snow by Wagamese Rice. With winter looming, a small northern Anishinaabe community goes dark. Cut off, people become passive and confused. Panic builds as the food supply dwindles. While the band council and a pocket of community members struggle to maintain order, an unexpected visitor arrives, escaping the crumbling society to the south. Soon after, others follow. Disintegrate, Dissociate by Ariel Twist. In her powerful debut collection of poetry, Ariel Twist unravels the complexities of human relationships after death and metamorphosis. In these spare yet powerful poems, she explores, with both rage and tenderness, the parameters of grief, trauma, displacement, and identity. Weaving together a past made murky by uncertainty and a present which exists in multitudes, Ariel Twist poetically navigates through what it means to be an Indigenous trans woman, discovering the possibilities of a hopeful future and a transcendent, beautiful path to regaining softness.